Well, I know it's been a while on the 73, so this is going to be part 2 of the routine maintenance that I'm doing on it. What I have been doing is trying to figure out this tack. So I have the dash all part, and what I want to do is plug in the one I have and see if it works. It's probably a little dark to see, but I have the plug that was in the tack right here plugged into this other one that I pulled out of a parts car. I'm too cheap to spend $100+ on a new circuit board, so every time I get a new electronic tack, I'll see if it works. So this one I know goes to 0 when power is applied, and what I've done is I have found the wire that comes from my ignition box, so I have that unhooked as well and have it plugged in to this tack right here. The one thing I don't know is if I need a tack filter in order to get it to read correctly. So we're going to try it with going this way, directly wired. And we also try it with this tack filter, which came out of the same car as the same tack, which it still looks like it's in good shape. So before I do that though, I need to figure out my battery connections. So I had the crappy dollar auto store type battery connections, and I don't really like them much, so I'm trying out something a little different. I'm trying out these style battery connections, and honestly, I've already installed this one and they feel pretty good. Once you get all the cable into this part of the cable, it screws onto this end, and what that does is that crimps everything down solid into this, so you don't really have any type of looseness or wiggling, which is what I had with these. It doesn't matter how tight you get them, they still move side to side and they kind of suck. So we'll see how these work. They were a lot more expensive than these, but we'll see how they work. So far I'm happy with this one. One other thing I need to do is I have a bunch of my systems wired to the battery cable at the starter. So for example, I know my ignition, my electronic fans, and my air conditioning all go to that same cable, which is good except for the fact that I believe those systems are drawing too much power away from the solenoid, so it doesn't get enough power to engage whenever I turn the key. So I don't remember if I showed this to you, but what will happen is I'll turn the key and all I'll get is a click, 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 and then maybe on the third or so try, the starter will engage, and it turns kind of slow. You can see the lights in the car kind of dim whenever it does it. So what I plan on doing is taking some wires off of that battery cable end and then running them to a battery which I'll put in directly to the battery. The battery that I have has double posts, so it has top post and side posts. I plan on running them to the side post and going from there. So we'll see how that goes. And hopefully that fixes my problem. If not, then I have more issues with the starter. It's more of an annoyance than a real problem, but we'll see. Alright, it is a little bit later, and let me show you what I've done. So I've got these battery connections all hooked up. They're a lot tighter than they used to be before. You could wiggle these wires. This one you can still kind of a little bit. I might go through and do that one again. But they're much better than these old ones. And also, if you look down there on the front of this battery, I don't know if you can see that, there's terminals in the front, and I have a block, battery block. You can't see that at all. Anyway, I have a block down there that has wires going to it, so that way those are on there, and it's just a little bit of a cleaner install. And since moving those wires from the starter, I'm hoping that when I turn the key, the starter will no longer just click. I have everything hooked up. So I'm going to take this tack, and I'm going to, do I have the ignition on? I have the ignition on. I'm going to move it so you can see it. And it should go to 0 when I give it power. There we go. Like I said before, whenever the car I would turn the key, you'd just get a click, click, click. It was really annoying. So I'm going to give it 2 or 3 or 4 bumps in a row to see if the starter will act a little bit better because I have less wires on the solenoid. Very good. Alright, so now is the moment of truth. We're going to fire it up just for a little bit, and we're going to see if this tack works. And if this tack works, I'm going to put it in. So it's kind of awkward because it's right next to my foot. Yay, it worked! It means I can put it in, which is exciting. And it goes back to 0 like it's supposed to. Alright, we're back working on this tack. So I have the tack out of the car, and I'll show you. The best way to do it, in my opinion, is you have to drop the column, so there's 2 bolts that hold it up, and there's 2 bolts that go through the firewall. You need to get all that out so it goes as far down as you can. And then you can take the screws out from the back of the tack and then push it through the side of the dash out that way. That's the easiest way, in my opinion, to do it, and that's what I did. This right here is the old tack, and I think the problem with it wasn't necessarily the tack board itself, since it did move and stuff. I think it was the motor inside, so basically the little silver cylinder in there that controls what the needle does. And the reason why is because if I do this, and it just kind of flops around. I think that's the issue with the one I put in, which I guess I didn't notice when I did it. I don't know. But this one, as you can see, it kind of stays where it's at, and once it gets power, it goes to 0. So I know this one works. You guys saw it work on the video. So I'm going to put this one back in the car, and then from there, we can work on this oil pressure gauge and get that working as well. Want to hear a sad story? I got the tack all in the car, all hooked up, and I forgot to 0 the needle. I was switching needles back and forth from one to the other, seeing which one was the better one, and one thing I didn't do is 0 the needle. So when this gets 12 volts, it's supposed to go straight to 0, and that only happens one way. So if I take the needle off and put it back on a different place than where it was, it's going to 0. I think it zeros to like here. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If you see my tack, and I put power to it, that's where the needle goes. So I need to take it off and put the needle back to 0. Pretty simple. Takes a few tries to get it perfect. Let's try it again. See, I'm a little under. Okay, let's try it again. That's pretty good. I'm going to call that good. One of the last things I want to do, since I have the car open anyway, is this oil pressure gauge, and the one in my hand is an electronic one. The one in my car has a tube, you can see it right there, that goes to the back of the gauge. Now, these had a plastic oil line stock. Somebody has upgraded mine to a brass line, but at the same time, it makes getting that out harder, and it also makes the potential for somehow oil leaking in my car, and that's never good. Plan will be to upgrade to this this electronic one. I'm going to have to replace the face of it with the older style, but that's okay. It's a pretty simple swap. Basically, like any gauge, you need 12 volts and you need the ohms wire. It grounds to the housing, so you don't have to worry about that. I have an extra connector out of a parts car. Normally, I believe this would go to your fuel gauge, but I'm going to go ahead and label it oil so I don't hook this stuff up wrong. But as you can see, it's going to fit very, very nicely. Now, Wilcox online, there where I buy a lot of my parts from, has this nifty schematic that shows you the blue wire, and I guess in my case it would be a tan wire that runs from the sender in the block to the side of the gauge, and then you get 12 volts on the other side. What I'm going to do before I bother to install this gauge is I'm going to put 12 volts to it and see if it will go to 0, and then that's a good indication that the gauge is working. 90% of the problems I found with gauges are because they're put together wrong, or the wiring's bad, or the senders are bad. It's almost never the gauges. Since I have no ohms wire attached to this gauge, I believe it's going to peg out when I put 12 volts to it. Let's see. Okay, so that's the classic reading of, you know, not getting any kind of reading from your sender. Now, the same thing happened on the black 77 that I'm working on. It would read like that all the time, and the second I hooked up a sender, it read great. So I'm going to assume that this gauge is a good gauge. As of right now, this is how oil pressure is read in my car. I apologize for the oil leaks. I have valve covers that are crappy and leaky, which is next on the list, but haven't found a pair that I like. But anyway, so it's basically a brass line that runs inside the car to the gauge. Now, the interesting thing about it is that stock was like a plastic line, so somebody's messed with this before. It's been upgraded. But with that being said, I still don't like oil running inside my car, and these electronic ones work just fine. This right here is what I'll be putting in its place. It's basically a big oil pressure sender. It should go right in, and there shouldn't be a problem. The main part that you need besides the oil pressure gauge is you need one of these backing plates. So if you look at where this gauge goes through, the little holes where the studs go through is going to be different than where the oil pressure line went through. It's going to be bigger. So luckily, if you buy a new gauge, usually you buy them in a set like this and it should work. So everything will transfer over. You know, all the back's the same, all the holes are the same. One other thing that you have to do is you have to get power for the gauge, and what I plan on doing is just grabbing it from a different gauge. Well, for example, you know, we could run a little jumper wire from this post down to the positive post on your new gauge, and then after you run your sender wire, boom, you're done. So it would be in the same fuse. All the gauges get their power from the same wire upstream, so it's really, you know, not a big deal to do that. The one thing you can't do is you can't connect it to your clock, because that's power all the time, whereas everything else is going to be key on only. So easy, just unplug everything, pop this out. It comes right up after you take all these screws out. Put your new gauge, or actually you're going to take all these other gauges and put them in your new piece, and then put it back together, run your wires, and you're done. Sorry for this being upside down, but I grabbed a connector from a parts car. It's for the fuel gauge, so you notice that it's identical to this one. I labeled it oil pressure, so it's never confused. But what I did was I ran a wire from the 12 volt side of the fuel gauge over to the 12 volt side of the new oil pressure gauge. So now it gets 12 volts and it works. So the last thing that I need to do, I need to run this tan wire down to the engine block and plug it in to where the oil pressure sender is, and it should go to 0 and it should work really well. Alright, here's the moment of truth. I don't think I can get both gauges on the same so there we go. So we're watching, make sure the tach works and see what happens with the oil pressure. And it's hard to do with one hand on the camera. I don't know if you guys can see that, but maybe you can. See if I have enough battery.